Hi, sleepy souls. Something inside you has been waiting a long time to be heard. Science calls it the inner child. That early layer of self, still carrying the first language you learned about who you are and whether you were enough. And the journey back to it is not nostalgia. It is how the nervous system finds its original flaw. The part most people don't expect. The voice you hear at your lowest moments is rarely your own. It was given to you before you had words to question it. Welcome to Sleepy Science. Tonight begins where the borrowed voice ends. Close your eyes and let your breath slow down gently. You are already moving towards something older and quieter. Let your whole body soften now. And now we begin. The inner child is not a metaphor. It is a neurological reality. Developmental psychologists and neuroscientists now understand that the experiences of early childhood leave measurable structural traces in the brain, particularly in regions governing emotion regulation, self-perception, and stress response. The amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex all show patterns shaped by the emotional environment of the first 7 to 10 years of life. When adults describe feeling suddenly small, ashamed, or afraid in ways that seem disproportionate to the present moment, what they are often experiencing is an older neural pathway, firing from a time when those responses made sense. The inner child is not a retreat from reality. It is a record of the reality that shaped the self before the self could fully observe it. Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development proposed that childhood passes through a series of distinct stages, each presenting a specific conflict that shapes the personality going forward. The earliest stages: trust versus mistrust in infancy, autonomy versus shame in toddlerhood, establish foundational templates for how safe the world feels and how worthy the self feels within it. When these early conflicts are not adequately resolved, the unfinished emotional business remains as an active undercurrent in adult life. It is not the memory of a moment that stays. It is the conclusion the child drew from that moment about what was possible, and whether they were welcome here. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth, identified that infants form distinct patterns of relating to caregivers based on how consistently their needs are met. These patterns, secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, do not disappear when childhood ends. Research published in Developmental Psychology and replicated across multiple longitudinal studies has shown that early attachment style predicts patterns in adult relationships, emotional regulation, and even physiological stress responses decades later. The child who learned that closeness was sometimes available and sometimes withheld often becomes the adult who monitors every relationship for signs of withdrawal. Not because something is wrong now, but because something learned then is still running. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region most associated with reasoning, planning, and emotional regulation, does not fully mature until the mid-20s. This means that during childhood and adolescence, the brain is processing emotional experiences with significantly less regulatory capacity than adults possess. Events that feel manageable to an adult nervous system may register as overwhelming to a child still developing one. What this means practically is that memories from early life carry a different emotional charge than memories formed later. The child could not contextualize. minimize or resolve the experience the way an adult might. It simply registered, fully, bodily, and without the softening that mature reflection allows. The concept of the inner child entered psychological literature through the work of Carl Jung, who wrote of the pure eternus, the eternal child archetype, as a psychological force representing both vulnerability and the capacity for renewal. Jung believed that psychological wholeness required integrating all parts of the self, including the parts that had been wounded or suppressed. Later clinicians, including John Bradshaw and Alice Miller, brought these ideas into therapeutic practice, arguing that many adult patterns of shame, self-sabotage, and emotional numbness traced directly to unmet needs in childhood. The recognition that healing the past is not the same as living in it became central to modern trauma-informed approaches to well-being. Adverse childhood experiences, often studied under the ACE framework, developed by researchers Vincent Felitti and Robert Ander in the 1990s, demonstrated a striking relationship between early hardship and long-term health outcomes. Adults who had experienced higher numbers of adverse childhood events showed elevated rates of depression, anxiety, autoimmune conditions, and cardiovascular disease decades later, not because the events were still present, but because the nervous system had learned to remain on alert long after the threat was gone. The inner child's unresolved experiences are not just emotional, they become biological. The body stores what the mind could not fully process. Implicit memory is the form of memory that operates below conscious awareness, the kind encoded through repetition and emotional experience rather than deliberate learning. It is why you feel uneasy in rooms that remind you of something difficult even if you cannot recall what it was. It is why certain tones of voice, certains silences, certain kinds of waiting can produce a physical reaction before your mind has time to explain it. Research in affective neuroscience, including work by Bessel van der Kolk and Joseph Ledoux, has shown that early emotional experiences are stored as implicit memory patterns that shape present moment reactions in ways the thinking mind cannot always intercept in time. The default mode network, a set of brain regions that become active during rest, daydreaming, and self-referential thought, is deeply involved in how we construct our sense of self. Studies using functional MRI imaging have found that narratives about the self, including the story of who we are and how we became that person, are processed extensively through this network. When the default mode network revisits painful or unresolved material from the past, it does so not to torment, but to search for resolution. The inner child's voice often arrives in the quiet of night, precisely because the default mode network becomes most active when external demands fall away. Winnicott's concept of the good enough parent offered a gentler frame for understanding early development than perfectionism allows. Donald Winnicott, a British pediatrician and psychoanalyst, argued that children do not need flawless caregiving. They need caregiving that is reliably close, genuinely attentive, and capable of repair after rupture. The repair, the return of warmth after conflict, the acknowledgement of a mistake, the consistent demonstration that connection is possible even after difficulty, was, in his view, more important than the absence of difficulty itself. Many adults who struggle with self-compassion grew up in environments where repair was rarely offered, leaving them without a model for how to offer it to themselves. The body keeps score, a phrase made widely known by psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk's landmark research and book of the same name, refers to the documented physiological effects of unprocessed emotional experience. Studies in somatic psychology have shown that trauma and unresolved childhood distress are often stored in the body as muscular tension, altered breathing patterns, elevated baseline cortisol, and disrupted interoceptive awareness. The inner child does not only live in memory, it lives in the way the shoulders tighten when a certain kind of silence enters a room. It lives in the breath that shortens when approval seems uncertain. The body has been telling its story all along. Schema therapy, developed by psychologist Jeffrey Young, proposes that early life experiences give rise to deep cognitive and emotional patterns called schemas. Stable, pervasive themes about the self and others that organize, experience, and shape behavior. Common schemas arising from childhood include abandonment, defectiveness, shame, emotional deprivation, and subjugation. These schemas do not announce themselves. They operate through automatic interpretations of events, through reactions that feel disproportionate, through an inner voice that insists something is wrong, even when nothing demonstrably is. Schema therapy's contribution was to show that these patterns are not character flaws. They were adaptations, the child's best attempt to make sense of a world they had limited power to change. Research in developmental neuroscience has identified critical periods, windows of time in early childhood during which the brain is particularly receptive to certain kinds of input. Language acquisition, social cognition, and emotional regulation all have these sensitive windows. Input received during critical periods has a disproportionate effect on the developing neural architecture. This is not determinism. The brain retains plasticity throughout life, and the science of neuroplasticity has demonstrated repeatedly that the adult brain continues to reorganize in response to new experience. But it does help explain why certain early experiences seem so resistant to ordinary updating. They were written into a brain that was, at that moment, building its most foundational structures. The polyvagal theory, proposed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges, and now widely used as a clinical framework in trauma-informed therapies, describes the autonomic nervous system as operating through three functional states. The social engagement system, associated with safety and connection, the sympathetic fight or flight response, associated with threat, and the dorsal vagal shutdown response, associated with overwhelm and freeze. While still debated in academic neuroscience, the model offers clinicians a useful map for understanding why children raised in unpredictable environments may develop nervous systems conditioned toward vigilance and shutdown as baseline settings. Conversations with the inner child, in this framework, often begin by offering the nervous system what it did not receive early on: reliable cues of safety. Neuroimaging studies have shown that recalling emotionally charged memories activates many of the same neural circuits involved in the original experience. The brain does not clearly distinguish between a vividly remembered threat and a present one. Both activate the amygdala. Both trigger stress hormones. Both can shift the body toward alert. This is why talking about painful childhood experiences without adequate support can sometimes re-traumatize rather than heal. Effective inner child work in therapy is not simply about remembering. It is about creating the conditions, presence, safety, attunement, under which the nervous system can process what was stored without reliving it fully. Memory is revisable, but it needs the right conditions to revise. Self-compassion research, led in large part by psychologist Kristin Neff, has documented that treating oneself with the same warmth one might offer a struggling friend produces measurable reductions in anxiety, depression, and rumination. Critically, Neff's studies found that self-compassion is not the same as self-esteem, which fluctuates based on performance and comparison. Self-compassion remains stable. It does not require that things be going well to activate. Many adults find self-compassion difficult not because they are selfish, but because they never received it. The inner child work that shifts this pattern does so not by analyzing the past, but by practicing now the quality of care the younger self was waiting for. Play is not only a behavior of childhood, it is a neurological state. Research by Stuart Brown at the National Institute for Play has documented that play activates areas of the brain associated with joy, learning, and social bonding, and that the capacity for play does not disappear with age. Adults who have learned to suppress play as unserious or unproductive often describe a flatness in experience, a sense that something pleasurable and spontaneous has gone quiet. This quality of aliveness, neuroscience suggests, is not a luxury. It is a signal that the nervous system is operating from safety rather than vigilance. Reconnecting with playfulness is often an early sign that the inner child has begun to feel welcome again. The neuroscience of shame has received particular attention in recent decades. Researchers including June Price-Tangney and Brené Brown have distinguished between guilt, the feeling that one has done something wrong, and shame, the feeling that one is wrong. Fundamentally, and as a whole, guilt motivates repair. Shame motivates hiding. Studies have shown that chronic shame activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same region involved in processing physical pain. Early environments that communicated shame as the appropriate response to imperfection leave children carrying what is effectively a continuous low-level pain signal. The inner child conversations that heal shame do not argue with it. They offer what shame starves on: the experience of being seen and not rejected. Reparenting is a concept used in therapeutic contexts to describe the process of providing, as an adult, the care and attunement that was insufficient in childhood. Cognitive behavioral therapists, schema therapists, and somatic practitioners use variations of this approach: guided imagery, compassionate self-talk, and body-based practices, to offer the nervous system new experiences that can gradually update older patterns. Research in interpersonal neurobiology, developed by Daniel Siegel, supports the biological basis of this approach. The brain's capacity for integration means that new relational experiences, even self-generated ones, can literally reshape the neural patterns associated with old wounds. The parent the inner child needed can, in part, be offered by the adult the inner child became. The concept of psychological integration, used widely in trauma-informed therapy, refers not to the resolution of all pain, but to the capacity to hold all parts of the self, including wounded parts, without fragmentation or suppression. Many adults cope with difficult childhood material through dissociation, intellectualization, or simply not looking at it. These strategies cost something. They require ongoing energy to maintain and often express themselves as numbness, disconnection, or a vague sense that something is missing. Integration does not demand revisiting every painful memory. It asks, gently, that the part who carries the wound no longer has to do so alone. That alone, not being alone with it, is often where healing quietly begins. The language children internalize about themselves does not only come from explicit statements. It comes from the quality of attention they receive, from what is noticed and what is overlooked, from whether their emotional states were treated as real or inconvenient. Developmental linguist Lev Vygotsky's work on private speech, the inner monologue that children develop, showed that self-talk begins as internalized dialogue with caregivers. The voices children carry inside themselves at first belong to someone else. What we say to ourselves in moments of failure, confusion, or vulnerability is often not our voice. It is the earliest voice that was given to us, still running on the same settings it was first programmed with. Somatic experiencing, a trauma healing modality developed by Peter Levine, works with the body's capacity to complete survival responses that were frozen during overwhelming experiences. Levine's clinical observation that animals in the wild rarely develop lasting trauma because they discharge activation through trembling and movement, led him to propose a theoretical framework for why humans, who typically suppress these responses, may carry activation long after threat has passed. Inner child work in the somatic tradition does not primarily ask the child part to speak. It asks the body to do what it could not do at the time: move, breathe, discharge, and trusts that a gradual sense of release will follow. Longitudinal research from the Minnesota Longitudinal Study of Risk and Adaptation, which has followed participants from infancy into adulthood for over 4 decades, found that early attachment security predicted a wide range of adult outcomes, including emotional resilience, quality of relationships, and capacity for self-reflection. Critically, the research also found that the relationship between early experience and adult outcome was not fixed. Adults who reflected coherently on their early experiences, who could describe difficult childhoods without losing coherence or becoming overwhelmed, showed attachment security in their adult relationships even when early security had been absent. The capacity to tell one's story with perspective is itself a form of healing. Research on narrative identity, the psychological theory that humans construct a sense of self through the stories they tell about their lives, has shown that the coherence, integration, and emotional tone of one's life narrative predicts psychological well-being. Psychologist Dan McAdams has found that individuals who construct narratives with what he calls redemptive sequences, accounts in which difficult experiences are understood as ultimately growth-generating, show greater resilience and life satisfaction than those whose narratives remain stuck in contamination sequences, where good is followed by irreversible damage. The inner child work that matters is not the excavation of the wound. It is the revising of what the wound means and what it says about who is left. Mindfulness-based approaches to inner child healing draw on research showing that present moment awareness, without judgment, creates the conditions under which difficult memories can be processed without being re-traumatizing. Studies using mindfulness-based therapies with trauma populations, including research published in Behavior Research and Therapy, have found that the capacity to observe emotional experience from a slight internal distance rather than being swept entirely within it significantly reduces the distress associated with difficult memories. When you can sit beside the part of you that is hurting without becoming entirely that part, you have created the internal space in which compassion becomes possible. The witness is not detachment. It is the adult self arriving to keep the child company. What these first 25 facts reveal is not a problem to be solved, but a pattern to be understood. The inner child is not a wound to be closed. It is a part of the self that has been carrying something, a conclusion, a fear, a way of bracing, for long enough that it has begun to feel like personality. But the conclusion was drawn with limited information, in a limited time, by a mind that had not yet grown into the complexity it would later become. The question this hour has been following opens here. The second arc begins where the first leaves unanswered. Not what happened, but what the nervous system learned to expect because of it. That is where Fact 26 begins. You're still here with us, and that means everything. A gentle subscribe helps another sleepless mind find their way home. Let's take a breath together now, one sleepy soul at a time. Right now, something in the language of this hour is finding the circuits where your earliest understanding of yourself lives. Those pathways, the ones that carry the first words you ever received about who you were, are not sealed. They are still listening. You don't need to do anything with that. What hasn't been reached yet is what happens when those circuits begin, slowly, to receive a different message. That is where the next hour begins. Now we continue. The nervous system's threat detection system, centered in the amygdala, processes incoming information approximately 5 times faster than the prefrontal cortex can evaluate it. This means that before your rational mind has assessed a situation, your body has already begun to respond based on stored pattern matching from prior experience. For adults who grew up in environments where threat was frequent or unpredictable, this system becomes highly sensitized, calibrated to detect even subtle cues that resemble past danger. Inner child work, in neurological terms, often involves the slow process of updating the amygdala's pattern library by introducing new experiences of safety to circuits that have been running old threat data for decades. Research on epigenetics, the study of how environmental experiences influence gene expression without altering the underlying genetic code, has found early indications that childhood adversity may produce epigenetic modifications affecting genes involved in stress response, immune function, and emotional regulation. Preliminary studies examining intergenerational transmission, including emerging research with descendants of Holocaust survivors, have found epigenetic patterns that differ from matched comparison groups, though findings remain under active investigation and replication. What this line of research tentatively suggests is that the effects of early experience may extend into biology and that healing practices like meditation and compassionate self-relation show early promise for producing measurable epigenetic shifts. Object Relations Theory, developed by Melanie Klein and elaborated by later theorists, including Ronald Fairbairn and Donald Winnicott, proposes that the psyche is organized around internalized representations of early relationships. We do not only remember our caregivers, we carry them internally as objects, psychological presences that continue to shape our inner experience. When early relationships were reliable and warm, these internal objects provide a kind of psychological anchor. When early relationships were unreliable or frightening, the internal objects can become sources of self-criticism rather than comfort. Inner child healing, in this tradition, involves transforming the internal relationship between the self and the self it has internalized. The research of developmental psychologist Mary Main, who extended Ainsworth's work on adult attachment through the adult attachment interview, found that the single best predictor of a child's attachment security was not the parent's own childhood experience, but the coherence with which the parent was able to narrate it. Parents who could speak about difficult childhoods with clarity, with compassion, and without becoming overwhelmed or dismissive, showed secure attachment relationships with their children, even when the childhoods they described had been hard. This finding, replicated many times since, points towards something profound. What we pass forward to those who depend on us is shaped less by what we experienced and more by whether we have made meaning of it. Neuroscientist Louis Cozzolino's work on the social brain describes the human nervous system as fundamentally designed for co-regulation, the process by which two nervous systems attune to one another, creating a shared state of calm that neither could as easily reach alone. This is why infants need more than food and warmth. They need the face of a responsive caregiver, the rhythmic voice, the attuned touch that communicates your internal state matters to me. When co-regulation is absent or inconsistent in early life, individuals often struggle as adults with self-soothing, the capacity to regulate their own emotional state from within. Part of what inner child work restores is the sense that one's internal states are worth attending to. Studies examining the effects of childhood emotional neglect, defined not as abuse but as the consistent failure to notice, respond to, or validate a child's emotional experience, have found lasting effects on adult emotional functioning that can rival the effects of more overtly traumatic events. Psychologist Jonis Webb's research in this area showed that adults who experienced emotional neglect often report a persistent sense of emptiness, difficulty identifying their own feelings, and a tendency to feel more comfortable attending to others' needs than their own. The inner child of emotional neglect did not receive injury so much as a specific kind of absence. And it is the absence, rather than any wound, that quietly formed the self. The relationship between inner child work and sleep quality has been examined in recent research. Studies published in journals including Sleep Health and Psychosomatic Medicine have found that unresolved attachment, anxiety, and early adversity are associated with elevated nighttime cortisol, fragmented sleep architecture, and reduced slow-wave sleep. The nervous system that learned to remain alert in childhood does not easily relinquish its vigilance in the dark. When external input fades and internal states become more prominent, therapeutic work that reduces attachment anxiety and builds internal safety has shown downstream benefits for sleep, as the system learns that rest is not vulnerable, but restorative. The body gradually releases its long-held readiness. Compassion-focused therapy, developed by psychologist Paul Gilbert, draws specifically on evolutionary neuroscience to explain why self-compassion is difficult for many people and how it can be cultivated. Gilbert identifies the threat system, evolved for rapid response to danger, as frequently hijacking the affiliative system, which underlies warmth, care, and connection. For individuals raised in critical or threatening environments, the threat system becomes overdeveloped relative to the affiliative system, making self-warmth feel threatening or even dangerous. His therapeutic approach involves deliberately activating the affiliative system through imagination, voice tone, physiological calming, and compassionate self-talk, teaching the nervous system that warmth is safe by offering it in conditions of regulated calm. Neuroplasticity research has repeatedly shown that the brain can build new neural pathways at any age, with new experiences and sustained practice producing measurable changes in brain structure and function. Studies examining the effects of psychotherapy on brain activation have found that successful treatment of depression, anxiety, and trauma produces changes in prefrontal amygdala connectivity. Changes, specifically, in the brain's capacity to regulate emotional responses through top-down cortical influence. What this means in practice is that the patterns formed in childhood, though durable, are not permanent. The circuits that carry the old conclusions can be accompanied by new ones. And with repetition, the new pathways become increasingly available as defaults. Healing is not overwriting. It is adding. The use of imagery in inner child work is supported by research in cognitive neuroscience on the relationship between imagination and emotional processing. When individuals vividly imagine offering comfort to a struggling version of themselves, many of the same neural circuits activate as would in an actual interpersonal interaction, including regions associated with empathy, social connection, and affiliative emotion. This is not self-deception. It is the deliberate use of the brain's own capacity to generate experience from within. Compassionate imagery practices, imagining the younger self in a specific memory, approaching them with warmth, offering what they needed, have shown measurable effects on shame, self-criticism, and emotional regulation in clinical research. The intersection of inner child psychology and mindfulness has been formalized in therapeutic approaches such as internal family systems therapy, developed by Richard Schwartz. IFS proposes that the psyche is naturally multiple, that the mind contains distinct parts, including younger exiled parts that carry early wounds, protective parts that formed to manage them, and a core self that possesses inherent wisdom and compassion. Therapy in this model involves enabling the self, calm, curious, connected, to make contact with the wounded part. Research on IFS outcomes, including studies published in Traumatology and the Journal of Psychotherapy Integration, has shown promise for reducing trauma symptoms and improving emotional well-being. Studies of self-talk and performance under stress have shown that referring to oneself in the second or third person, saying, "You can do this," rather than "I can do this," produces a small but measurable reduction in anxiety and improvement in performance. Researchers, including Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan, have found that self-distancing through language activates areas of the prefrontal cortex associated with regulatory wisdom, creating a slight separation between the experiencing self and the observing self. This linguistic shift mirrors something natural in inner child work: the capacity to speak to the younger self as someone worthy of consideration, not merely as a background voice to be managed or suppressed. The window of tolerance, a concept introduced by Dan Siegel and extended by therapist Pat Ogden, describes the optimal zone of nervous system arousal within which emotional experience can be processed without becoming overwhelming or shutting down. This window tends to be narrower in individuals who experienced early adversity, meaning that even moderate emotional activation may push them out of the range in which learning and integration can occur. Effective inner child work operates within this window, not forcing contact with difficult material before the system is resourced, but gently expanding the window over time. The work moves at the pace of the nervous system, not the pace of narrative. Research on gratitude and its neurological mechanisms has found that consistent gratitude practice activates the medial prefrontal cortex and produces sustained reductions in cortisol and inflammatory markers. In the context of inner child work, gratitude directed toward the younger self, acknowledging what that child survived, what it carried, what it figured out with limited tools, has been proposed as a powerful reframe. The child who adapted by becoming invisible, or by becoming the caretaker, or by learning to stop asking for too much, was not weak. It was intelligent. It found the best available strategy in an environment of limited options. That recognition is itself a form of the compassion the child was waiting for, a pattern that emerges across every framework examined so far. Attachment theory, schema therapy, somatic experiencing, compassion-focused therapy, internal family systems, is the centrality of one thing: witnessing. To be witnessed is to have one's experience acknowledged as real, as mattering, as worthy of attention. For many adults, the core wound of childhood was not dramatic. It was the accumulated experience of an inner life that went unseen. The inner child's deepest need was not perfection from others. It was the reliable experience of someone noticing, genuinely, unhurriedly, without an agenda, that something was happening inside, and that it was worth knowing about. You've been listening for a while now, thoughts still flickering like candlelight. Just notice. Don't judge. Just notice where your mind is. We're exploring the deepest conversations the self can have, the ones the adult finally offers the child who was waiting. Strange, beautiful, and perfectly calm. Let's drift onward together. Therapeutic research has increasingly examined the role of awe, a state of expanded self-perception associated with vastness and connection, in reducing the chronic self-preoccupation that often underlies anxiety and self-criticism. Studies published in Psychological Science have found that experiences of awe measurably reduce markers of the default mode network's self-referential chatter, producing a temporary but profound quieting of the inner critic. For the inner child work that aims to soften the critical voice, awe offers an unexpected ally, the sense that one is smaller than the noise in one's head, and the relief that produces. The self is not the largest thing in the room. The cosmos holds it, and the holding is kind. The relationship between chronic self-criticism and health has been documented in studies linking high internal self-judgment to elevated inflammatory markers and disrupted cortisol rhythms. The inner critic is not only a psychological discomfort, it is a physiological burden the body carries continuously. Research teams, including those at the University of California, Berkeley, have found that self-compassion practices, including loving-kindness meditation and compassionate body scan exercises, produce measurable reductions in inflammatory markers over weeks of consistent practice. The inner child who receives warmth rather than criticism does not only feel better. The body registers the difference in its own quiet biological language. Emotion regulation research distinguishes between strategies that modify emotional experience and strategies that suppress it. Suppression, which involves inhibiting the outward expression of emotion without changing its internal experience, has been consistently associated with poorer long-term outcomes, including increased physiological reactivity, greater difficulty in close relationships, and higher rates of depression. Reappraisal, which involves changing the meaning attributed to an emotional experience, produces substantially better outcomes. What inner child work offers, in this framing, is not the suppression of old emotional patterns, but their reappraisal, the offering of new meaning to old experience, new context for old conclusions, new compassion for old coping strategies. Research in positive psychology has documented what is known as post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon in which individuals who have experienced significant adversity report, over time, meaningful increases in life appreciation, relational depth, personal strength, and spiritual awareness. This is not a guarantee or a requirement for healing. It is an observation that the psyche has a natural tendency toward integration and even expansion following difficulty, when adequate support and time are available. The inner child who was shaped by early hardship carries not only the wound, but also the unusual depth of awareness, the sensitivity to others, the hard-won capacity for empathy that those who did not struggle may never fully develop. Both are true simultaneously. Developmental research on resilience has shifted its focus from identifying why some individuals are damaged by adversity to understanding what protective factors allow others to emerge intact or even strengthened. A consistent finding across multiple longitudinal studies is that the presence of at least one stable, responsive, attuned relationship during childhood, often a grandparent, teacher, older sibling, or neighbor, rather than a primary caregiver, can serve as a powerful buffer against the long-term effects of early difficulty. What this research emphasizes is the fundamental human need for connection, for being seen and accompanied, and the capacity of even partial, imperfect relational experiences to offer the nervous system what it was not receiving elsewhere. Body-based practices, including yoga, tai chi, and conscious breathing, have been shown in clinical research to improve the capacity for emotional regulation and reduce symptoms of trauma and attachment disruption. The mechanism involves the bidirectional relationship between the body and the nervous system. Physical practices that slow the breath, release muscular tension, and orient the body towards safety directly communicate through the vagus nerve, and autonomic pathways that the threat response can de-escalate. For the inner child who lives partly in the body's chronic readiness, these practices offer something the mind alone cannot always provide: direct physiological evidence that it is safe to soften now. The body learns safety through the body, not only through understanding. The process of mentalizing, the capacity to understand one's own and others' behavior in terms of underlying mental states such as beliefs, desires, and feelings, develops through early attachment relationships and is closely linked to prefrontal cortical development. Research by Peter Fonagy and his colleagues at University College London has shown that parents with high mentalizing capacity tend to raise children with secure attachment and good emotional regulation, and that mentalizing capacity can be developed in adults through therapeutic work. The inner child who grows up in an environment of limited mentalizing, where feelings are not named, interpreted, or treated as real, often becomes an adult who struggles to locate and trust their own internal states. Grief is an important but often overlooked dimension of inner child work. Many adults carry unacknowledged grief for the childhood they needed but did not have. Not dramatic loss, necessarily, but the quieter grief for the consistent warmth that was absent, for the encouragement that was withheld, for the version of childhood that is still possible in imagination but did not happen in life. Research on disenfranchised grief, grief for losses that society does not recognize as legitimate, has found that the inability to openly mourn a loss delays its integration. Giving the inner child permission to mourn what it missed is not self-pity. It is honest acknowledgement, and honest acknowledgement is where healing tends to begin. The capacity for self-forgiveness, as distinct from self-compassion, has been studied in relation to the inner child's internalized shame, where self-compassion responds to present suffering with warmth. Self-forgiveness addresses past actions or perceived failures with release. Research published in the Journal of Positive Psychology has found that self-forgiveness reduces rumination, decreases depressive symptoms, and is associated with greater willingness to repair harm in relationships. For many adults, the inner child carries not only wounds received, but also shame about what the child did in response. The ways it lashed out, withdrew, became difficult or demanding or invisible. Forgiving the child who adapted is part of returning to it with full acceptance. Halfway through tonight's journey, the question that opened this hour has turned a corner. We began by asking how to reconnect with the inner child, how to bridge the distance between the adult self and the younger self still carrying its original conclusions. Now the answer is forming not as a technique, but as a quality of attention. Every framework, neuroscience, attachment theory, somatic work, compassion practice, points toward the same thing. The inner child does not need to be fixed. It needs to be accompanied. It needs the experience of being with someone who is not in a hurry to change it. The second half of tonight follows what that accompaniment actually feels like. What just opened? The question of what changes when the inner child stops being alone with what it carries is not only a psychological question. You may be the first person who has ever sat with that part of yourself without wanting it to hurry up and heal. The second half of tonight follows what that sitting quietly makes possible. Notice your breath. Notice that even the questions soften when they are not being rushed. Now we continue. When individuals report feeling triggered, experiencing an emotional response that feels disproportionate to the current moment. What neuroimaging research suggests is happening is an implicit memory activation, in which the amygdala has matched current sensory input to a stored pattern from early experience and is broadcasting an old alarm. The prefrontal cortex, which would normally contextualize and moderate this response, is temporarily overridden. Understanding this mechanism does not make the trigger disappear, but it offers something important: a map. The reaction that feels like a flaw in the present self is often a reasonable response from a younger self to a situation that no longer exists. The language of needs, identifying what one actually needs in a moment, rather than what one has always done instead, is a skill many adults raised in emotionally neglectful environments never fully developed. Marshall Rosenberg's work in nonviolent communication identified universal human needs for safety, belonging, autonomy, understanding, meaning, and play as the hidden engine beneath most emotional conflict. Inner child work involves learning to pause in distress and ask not what is wrong with me, but what is the younger part of me needing right now. This shift from judgment to need is small in language and significant in its effects. Studies examining the relationship between self-compassion and perfectionism have found that individuals with high self-compassion show measurably lower perfectionism and higher tolerance for failure and imperfection. This is relevant to inner child work because perfectionism is frequently a coping strategy developed in childhood in response to environments where conditional approval, love contingent on performance, was the primary relational experience. The child who learned that love was earned rather than given learns, often, to strive harder and tolerate failure less. Self-compassion research suggests that releasing perfectionism is not about lowering standards. It is about releasing the belief that love requires standards to be earned in the first place. The relationship between inner child healing and interpersonal relationships is well documented in attachment research. Adults who have engaged in sustained self-reflective work, including therapy, journaling, mindfulness, and deliberate examination of their own relational patterns, show measurably improved relationship quality, greater capacity for intimacy, and less reactivity to relational stress. The mechanism appears to involve increases in earned security. The psychological research term for attachment security, developed through reflective effort rather than secure early experience. What this suggests is that the work of meeting the inner child is not only personal. Its benefits flow outward into every relationship. Curiosity has been identified in positive psychology research as a core component of psychological well-being and a particularly effective antidote to the shame and self-judgment that accompany inner child wounds. When curiosity replaces criticism as the default response to one's own struggles, when I wonder why I do, that replaces what is wrong with me, the prefrontal cortex remains engaged and the amygdala's threat response is reduced. Curiosity is incompatible with contempt. The mind cannot genuinely wonder and simultaneously condemn. Research by Todd Kashdan at George Mason University found that trait curiosity predicts resilience, life satisfaction, and emotional flexibility, qualities the inner child quietly needs. the concept of earned security in adult attachment. The finding that individuals who experienced insecure or difficult early relationships can develop secure attachment patterns through reflective effort has been supported by a growing body of longitudinal research. Mary Main's work with the adult attachment interview found that narrative coherence, the capacity to speak about one's early experiences with clarity, perspective, and balanced emotion, was itself the marker of earned security, regardless of the experiences described. The inner child does not need its story changed. It needs the adult to hold the story gently, clearly, without being crushed by it or fleeing from it. Interoception, the brain's perception of the body's internal states, has been identified as a foundational capacity for emotional awareness and regulation. Research by Sarah Garfinkel and Antonio Damasio has shown that poor interoceptive awareness, difficulty sensing signals from the body such as heartbeat, breathing, and tension, is associated with alexithymia, the clinical term for difficulty identifying and describing feelings. Adults who grew up in environments where internal states were consistently dismissed develop reduced interoceptive capacity. Reconnecting with the body's signals is part of reconnecting with the inner child's language, because the child knew its own states before it learned to doubt them. Longitudinal studies on gratitude have found that sustained gratitude practice produces not only improved subjective well-being, but also increased relational generosity, reduced envy, and greater capacity for empathy. In the context of inner child work, gratitude directed toward difficult experiences, not toxic positivity, but honest recognition of what difficulty taught, has been associated with narrative integration, the capacity to hold adversity as part of one's story without defining or condemning the story. The child who survived a hard beginning did something real. It brought itself here. And here, in this quiet hour, with the breath slowing, is a place the child always deserved to arrive. Research on the neuroscience of dreaming has found that REM sleep plays a central role in emotional memory consolidation and the regulation of threat-related neural activity. Matthew Walker's research at UC Berkeley demonstrated that REM sleep strips emotional charge from difficult memories, allowing the brain to retain the informational content while reducing the visceral distress of recollection. Dreams in this period often process the emotional residue of the day, and there is emerging evidence that they also process longer-term relational and self-relevant patterns. Sleep is not merely rest. For the inner child's unfinished business, the night may be one of its quiet repair workshops. Voice tone carries significant neurological weight in the activation of safety and threat responses. Research in vocal communication has found that the prosodic qualities of speech, its rhythm, pitch, contour, and warmth, activate social engagement circuits independently of the content of what is said. This is why a harsh tone from a trusted person can produce disproportionate distress, and why a gentle tone can calm a frightened nervous system before the words land. Many inner child wounds were delivered not through dramatic events, but through tone, the flatness of indifference, the edge of impatience. Many healings begin with the offering of a different kind of voice. Research on writing as a healing modality, pioneered by psychologist James Pennebaker, found that expressing difficult emotional experiences in writing produced measurable improvements in immune function, reduced medical visits, and improved psychological well-being in clinical populations. Pennebaker's studies showed that it was not venting, but narrative construction, the development of a coherent story about the experience, including its causes and meaning, that produced these effects. Writing to the inner child, letters that offer what the child needed to hear, that name what was hard, that acknowledge what was managed with inadequate tools, is one of the more powerful applications of this research. The polyvagal ladder, a clinical tool derived from Porges' polyvagal framework, maps the nervous system's 3 proposed states along a continuum. Social engagement at the top, sympathetic mobilization in the middle, and dorsal vagal shutdown at the bottom. Practitioners use this model to help individuals identify where they are in real time and develop practices for moving toward connection. The inner child who chronically defaults to lower states on this ladder is not broken. It is efficiently using the strategies it developed when higher states were not available. The work is not to shame those strategies, but to offer the nervous system evidence that higher ground is accessible. Research in developmental psychology has found that children who receive consistent emotional attunement from caregivers, who experience being read accurately, responded to appropriately, and accompanied through emotional states, develop what is called reflective functioning, the capacity to understand their own and others' behavior in terms of inner mental states. High reflective functioning in adults is associated with secure attachment, effective emotion regulation, and the ability to repair relational ruptures. It is also strongly associated with the quality of caregiving the individual offers to their own children. And both forms of cycle can be interrupted by deliberate self-reflection at any point in a life. Mindful self-compassion programs, including the 8-week MSC protocol developed by Kristin Neff and Christopher Germer, have been studied in randomized controlled trials and found to produce significant reductions in depression, anxiety, shame, and self-criticism, while increasing life satisfaction and mindfulness skills. A notable finding was that participants who had experienced significant childhood adversity showed the largest gains in self-compassion, suggesting that those who most needed the practice had the most capacity to benefit. The inner child who was never taught self-care is not incapable of receiving it. It simply needs to be offered, consistently, warmly, in whatever small form is available today. Across decades of developmental research, one conclusion has emerged with unusual consistency. The capacity to repair matters more than the absence of rupture. Relationships that demonstrate the ability to break and return, to hurt and acknowledge, to disconnect and reconnect, produce more secure internal models than relationships that never rupture because they never risk genuine closeness. The inner child raised in an environment where conflict was either chronic or completely avoided often has no model for repair. Learning that a relationship can survive difficulty, that rupture is not abandonment, is often one of the most transformative realizations of adult inner child work. Body image and the inner child intersect in ways that developmental researchers have begun to examine. Studies have found that critical or shaming messages about a child's body are encoded with particular intensity because they combine felt vulnerability with the relational wound of being found unacceptable. Adults who carry body shame often report it as qualitatively different from other forms of self-criticism. More visceral, more primary, more like a fact than a belief. Somatic and inner child therapies approach the body not as a problem to be solved, but as a part of the self waiting, like every other part, to be welcomed back. Research on humor and healing has found that the capacity for self-deprecating humor, laughter at one's own situation without contempt, is associated with higher levels of psychological resilience and is distinct from the self-mockery that masks shame. Studies examining humor in therapeutic contexts have found that moments of gentle laughter with the self, including about the absurdity of one's own patterns, can create micro-moments of self-compassion that interrupt habitual self-judgment cycles. The inner child who discovers that some of what it feared has a slightly absurd quality. Childhood fears, given the perspective of time, can find that laughter. 2. Is a form of welcome. Studies in expressive arts therapy have found that non-verbal approaches to inner child healing, drawing, clay work, movement, and sound, can access material that verbal processing leaves untouched. This is consistent with findings in neuroscience about the storage of pre-verbal and implicit memory in subcortical regions not readily accessed through language-based reflection. For experiences encoded before full language development, art-based approaches offer an alternative channel. The inner child does not always speak in sentences. It speaks in colors, shapes, and sounds. And the adult willing to meet it there finds a conversation words alone cannot begin. Research on self-disclosure and well-being has found that the capacity to share one's inner experience with others, to allow another person to know something real and difficult about what it is to be you, is associated with reduced psychological distress, improved relationship quality, and enhanced sense of belonging. The risk of disclosure is real. Vulnerability requires a safe recipient, but the permanent maintenance of a performance of okayness carries its own cost. The inner child, who learned that its inner life was unwelcome, became the adult who keeps that life largely hidden. And the hidden life grows heavier with each passing year. Loneliness research, including work by John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago, found that chronic loneliness produces measurable changes in gene expression, immune function, sleep architecture, and cardiovascular health. Loneliness is not simply an emotion. It is a physiological state with biological consequences. What is particularly relevant here is Cacioppo's finding that the loneliness most damaging to health is not social isolation, but disconnection from one's own authentic inner experience. The loneliness of not being known, even by oneself. The inner child's tender spot. The feeling of emotional deprivation and isolation is not a weakness. It is a signal about a fundamental human need. Breathing practices have been shown in multiple clinical studies to directly reduce amygdala activation and cortisol levels, while increasing heart rate variability, a marker of nervous system flexibility and resilience. The breath is unique among autonomic processes because it sits at the intersection of voluntary and involuntary control. It proceeds on its own, but it can also be consciously directed. For the inner child work that happens in the body, the breath offers a direct line between intention and physiology. To slow the breath is to send a message to the oldest part of the nervous system. The danger has passed. You can soften now. Research on forgiveness, defined in psychological literature as the releasing of resentment toward another without requiring their acknowledgement or change, has found consistent associations between forgiveness and improved cardiovascular health, reduced cortisol, and greater psychological well-being. Forgiving caregivers for the limitations of their early parenting is often a complex and non-linear process. It does not mean condoning harm. It does not mean pretending harm did not occur. It means releasing the inner child from the burden of carrying the unresolvable wish that things had been different. A wish that, in its unresolved form, keeps the child waiting for an apology that may never come. The neuroscience of kindness has shown that acts of kindness toward others activate reward circuitry in the brain, specifically the ventral tegmental area and the striatum, producing a warm internal state associated with bonding and belonging. Studies have found that imagined and remembered acts of kindness activate overlapping neural circuitry. This is relevant to inner child work because imagining offering genuine care to the younger self activates some of the same reward circuitry as receiving care from another. The inner child that has spent years in the cold discovers something almost startling when the adult self finally turns toward it. The warmth is available from within. Research on identity development in adulthood has found that individuals who engage in deliberate identity exploration, examining who they are, what they value, and where those values came from, show greater psychological well-being and resilience than those who adopted a fixed identity early and never revisited it. The inner child carries the earliest chapters of identity. Many were written under duress, in conditions the child did not choose, with conclusions that served a specific early environment but do not necessarily serve the adult it created. Revisiting those chapters is not destabilization. It is the natural completion of a developmental process interrupted by survival. What the inner child has been teaching across these 75 facts is something the original questions did not anticipate. Returning to the inner child through the dream of this hour was never about reaching back into the past. It was always about releasing the past from its obligation to keep running in the present. The original memories, the original wounds, the original conclusions are not deleted. They are accompanied now by an adult self that has spent this hour listening, that knows something the child did not, that the child survived, that the story continued, and that what comes after the hard beginning is part of who you are. You might be feeling softer now. That is as it should be. Breathe slowly. Notice the cycles. Inhale, exhale. The quiet rhythm your body has been maintaining without being asked. You are not separate from what you have been learning tonight. It is already in you. You don't need to hold any of it. Let everything continue in its own unhurried order, like breath returning, like warmth that was always there, simply waiting to be received. We're almost there now. The hardest thing about the inner child is not the wound. It is the loyalty. The child remained loyal to a version of reality that was given to it early. And loyalty, in a young nervous system, looks a great deal like survival. What the night softly asks is not that the loyalty be abandoned, only that it be understood as having always been love in a form that the available conditions allowed. Every adult who has ever felt inexplicably young in a moment of stress has experienced the time collapse of implicit memory. The body does not always know when the danger ended. It kept its watch long after the night it was posted for had passed. What the night offers is not a command to stand down, only a reminder, in the softest available terms, that the original post no longer requires staffing. Research in interpersonal neurobiology has found that the experience of being truly seen, acknowledged, mirrored, received, produces measurable changes in nervous system activity. The brain lights up differently in the presence of genuine attunement than in the presence of even kind but inattentive regard. Something in the nervous system knows the difference. The inner child always knew the difference. And the adult self, turning toward it now with this quality of slow, unhurried attention, is offering something the nervous system recognizes as real. The child who became very good at not needing things learned something that served an important purpose. In an environment where needs were inconvenient, invisibility was practical. The skill was real. What the knight gently asks is not that the skill be surrendered, only that it no longer be applied to oneself. You are allowed to need things now. The environment has changed. The old calibration can rest. One of the more consistent findings across therapeutic modalities is that the inner child does not need an elaborate explanation of why it carries what it carries. It needs to know that the adult is aware of it. Not fixing, not analyzing, simply aware. In the language of polyvagal theory, this is the signal of a safely engaged social nervous system. The face turned toward, the attention held, the presence sustained. The child has been here all along. What is new is that someone finally noticed. Sleep itself, in a quiet way, is a form of inner child communication. The dreams that surface in REM often carry images, relationships, and emotional textures that belong to earlier periods of life. The child returns at night, not to disturb, but to continue the conversation the day was too busy to hold. Listening to that conversation, not interpreting, simply sitting with the images and the feelings they carry, is a practice the knight has always been trying to teach. Neuroscience has confirmed that the quality of attention offered to another's distress matters as much as the content of any response. A face that softens, a voice that slows, a body that remains present rather than retreating. These physiological signals of attunement travel through the vagal nerve faster than words can form. The inner child's need was not primarily for explanation. It was for company. The kind of company that does not leave when things get uncomfortable. The path back to the inner child does not require memory. For many adults, early childhood exists as feeling rather than narrative. A quality of light in a particular kind of afternoon. A specific texture of longing. A physical sensation rather than a retrievable story. The inner child lives in those textures. Meeting it does not require excavating a memory. It requires only turning toward the feeling with the kind of interest you would offer something you found worth knowing. What inner child work teaches, in the end, is not very different from what sleep teaches. The capacity to release without losing, to put down the day, the performance, the monitoring, the management of appearances, and discover that the self underneath the performance is not a lesser version, but a more honest one. The child did not perform. It simply was. And in the permission of this particular night, something is allowed to simply be again. Research on the long-term effects of inner child work, including outcome studies on schema therapy, IFS, and somatic approaches, consistently finds that the most lasting changes come not from insight alone, but from the accumulated experience of repeated moments of self-compassion. Not a single breakthrough, not an epiphany, but the slow accumulation of the adult self turning toward the child, again and again, with the same quality of unhurried attention, until the child begins to trust that this time the turning is permanent. The nervous system heals in the direction of safety. This is not a philosophy. It is a biological fact about how threat systems and affiliative systems interact over time. Every moment of genuine self-compassion, however small, is a data point the nervous system files under. Safety is possible here. With enough data points, the default begins to shift. Not all at once, not dramatically, but measurably, quietly, like light changing angle across a floor. You notice it, and then you cannot remember the room being any other way. The inner child is not the only part of you that has been waiting. The adult self, the one that has been managing and monitoring and achieving and holding everything together, has also been waiting. Waiting for permission to stop performing. Waiting to discover whether there is something underneath the competence that does not require proving. The conversation between them, adult and child, learned self and original self, is not a therapy session. It is a homecoming. And homecomings, by definition, require only that you arrive. In many psychological traditions, the deepest healing occurs in the discovery that beneath the wound, beneath the adaptation, beneath the coping that became character, the original self is intact, not damaged, not lesser, simply waiting, with patience, for conditions that felt safe enough to step forward into. Tonight has been creating those conditions. One slow fact at a time. The safety has been building. And the original self, the one that existed before the first conclusion was drawn, is closer now than it was an hour ago. Research on meaning-making following adversity has found that the capacity to locate difficult experience within a larger story, rather than as the final word on one's value, is one of the most reliable predictors of long-term resilience. The inner child did not have access to that narrative. It was inside the experience, without the perspective time and reflection bring. What the adult can offer is exactly that. The knowledge that the story continued, that the chapter was hard, and there were more chapters. Something in the deepest layers of the nervous system is built not for performance but for rest, not for achievement but for belonging, not for the management of others' perceptions but for the simple experience of being present in a safe place. The inner child knew this before it learned to monitor, before it learned to minimize, before it learned to perform for an uncertain audience. It still knows. And in the quiet of this hour, with the breath moving slowly, that knowing is beginning, gently, to remember itself. The science of bonding has shown that oxytocin, the neuropeptide associated with trust, attachment, and social warmth is released through physical touch and direct social contact. Animal and early human studies suggest that compassionate attention directed inward may activate related affiliative circuits. When that attention is directed toward the younger self, the physiology may respond in kind. The inner child work happening in you tonight is not purely abstract. Your body is participating in something that resembles care offered across time. The child you were did the best it could with what it had. This is not a consolation. It is a finding. Developmental psychology has documented extensively how children adapt intelligently to their available environments. Not because they are wise, but because adaptation to the relational environment is the primary developmental drive of the first years of life. The strategies were appropriate. They were the right responses to the actual conditions. The only thing that is different now is the conditions. And conditions, it turns out, can be changed. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a wound while pretending it is not there. The energy required to manage the adaptation, to keep the younger parts suppressed and functional, is real and continuous. What many people report following sustained inner child work is not the dramatic resolution of pain, but the quiet release of an effort they had not realized they were making. The tiredness lifts. Not all at once, but something that was held begins, gradually, to be set down. The conversation you are having with your inner child tonight is real, not metaphorical. The neural circuits that carry your earliest self-concept are active in the quiet of this hour. The attention you have been offering, however gently, however imperfectly, has been received by the same systems that have been waiting, with considerable patience, for exactly this quality of company. You have not been listening to a story about someone else. You have been, in whatever small way was available to you tonight, present for yourself. Rest, in the deepest sense, is the experience of the nervous system releasing its duty of care. The watch that has been kept, the monitoring, the readiness, softens in the presence of genuine safety. The inner child, whose vigilance was one of its first learned skills, does not release the watch easily. But tonight, in the company of this quiet, something can begin to soften. The watch can rest. The duty, for this one night, can be put down. What remains after the facts is not a conclusion. It is a beginning. The science of inner child healing resolves not into a formula, but into a practice. The practice of turning toward the younger self with consistency, with warmth, with the quality of attention that communicates you are here, and I am not leaving. Every night that begins this way is a night the nervous system files one more data point under safety. And safety, accumulated in small increments, is what wholeness is quietly made of. The child who became you is not behind you. It is in you, in the way you hold uncertainty, in the textures of longing that arrive without explanation, in the warmth you feel in particular kinds of light. Meeting it is not a retreat. It is a recognition. The recognition that the full journey includes the beginning, and the beginning includes the child. And the child, however it arrived at this night, deserves the same quality of welcome that this particular hour has slowly been offering. What inner child healing teaches most deeply is not a psychology. It is a simple biological truth. The nervous system was always designed to receive care, not to earn it, not to prove worthiness before accessing it, simply to receive it, because receiving it is what allows the system to function as it was built to. The child who did not receive that care did not fail. The supply was simply inadequate to the need. Tonight, the supply and the need are finally in the same room. The original self, the self before the first adaptation, before the first conclusion about what it was safe to be, is not lost. Psychology does not know of a case in which it was fully extinguished. It waits, with the particular patience of something that has nowhere else to be. The adult who turns toward it tonight, with whatever quality of attention they can manage, is doing enough. More than enough. The child did not need perfection. It needed only the reliable presence of someone willing to stay. The answer to tonight's question, how to reconnect with the inner child, how to cross the distance between the adult self and the younger self, still carrying its original conclusions, was never a technique. The answer was always this: to arrive. To be present in the same room as the part of yourself that has been waiting. Not to fix it, not to analyze it, but to arrive and to stay, and to offer the quality of attention that says, I see you. I know you are here, and you are welcome. The journey that began in the first moments of tonight has resolved not into silence, but into company. We followed the amygdala's old alarm system through to the affiliative circuits, opening in the quiet of this hour. We listened to what attachment theory and somatic research have been documenting for decades. The inner child does not need to be fixed. It needs to be accompanied. What began as a question about connection became fact by fact, a practice of it. The science was always pointing toward the same destination. Tonight, something arrived. The original memories are not gone. They are different now, accompanied, witnessed, held by an adult self that has spent this hour learning to turn toward rather than away. What the child was carrying was always too heavy for one. It was never meant to be carried alone. In these final minutes, take the deepest breath you can. Think about consciousness itself. Yours. Mine. Everyone listening. All awareness everywhere. Perhaps all connected in ways we don't yet understand. You are not alone in the universe of minds. The child you were is not separate from the person breathing here now. Let your entire being dissolve into the ocean of consciousness, into the space before the first conclusion was drawn, before the first adaptation was made, into the original softness that was always underneath. Prepare for deep sleep. No distances left. No watching required. Only peace. If tonight's quiet conversation brought you a little closer to the part of yourself that has been waiting, a gentle like, subscribe, or share helps another sleepless mind find their way here too. One quiet tap, one sleepy soul at a time. But there's no need to do anything now. Nothing at all. You've traveled far tonight. Allow these thoughts of the inner child to fade now, like old letters gently return to their place, leaving only a steady, unhurried calm behind. Let your breathing deepen. Let your body feel heavier. as if the ground beneath you has been waiting all evening for this moment of full arrival. If sleep comes, let it carry you like a tide returning to deep water, smoothly, inevitably, into a place beyond time and weight. Deep sleep with mind science has spent many hours in this territory, the space where the inner life and the science of self quietly meet. The next hour follows the part of tonight's question that this one didn't have time to finish. That hour is waiting whenever you are ready. But if your eyes are closed, to stay there. Stay in the darkness that feels safe and warm. Tomorrow, the inner child will still be there. And now it knows you know where to find it. Tonight belongs to stillness. Rest well, gentle soul. And remember, returning to the original memories is not a retreat into the past. It is the release of the past from its obligation to keep running in the present, where science becomes the softest place to rest. Good night.